Good morning again, everyone. I'm Hira Jaleel, visiting assistant professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I'd like to welcome you to our first session of the final day of the conference, titled Translating the Language of Whales and Other Species, Legal, Ethical, and Policy Implications. This panel will explore key evidence demonstrating the complexity and sophistication of language-like features in whales and other species, discuss a strategy to advance case law, and develop legal and ethical guidelines necessary for the protection of these species. Our two wonderful panelists for today are David Gruber and César Rodriguez-Garavito. David Gruber is the founder and president of Project CETI, Cetacean Translation Initiative, a nonprofit interdisciplinary scientific and conservation initiative on a mission to listen to and translate the communication of sperm whales. He's a distinguished professor of biology and environmental sciences at the City University of New York, Baruch College, and the CUNY Graduate Center. His interdisciplinary research bridges animal communication, climate science, marine biology, microbiology, molecular biology, and his inventions include technology to perceive the underwater world from the perspective of marine animals. César Rodriguez-Garavito is professor of clinical law at NYU and the founding director of the More Than Human Rights, MOTH, project at NYU School of Law. He is the chair of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and the director of the Terra Clinic at NYU School of Law. César is a human rights and environmental justice scholar and practitioner whose recent work and publications focus on climate change, indigenous peoples' rights, and the rights of nature movement. His latest books are More Than Human Rights, An Ecology of Law, Thought and Narrative for Earthly Flourishing, and Climate Change on Trial, Mobilizing Human Rights to Accelerate Climate Action. So please join me in welcoming our two panelists today.
Thank you, Hira, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm David Gruber, my first animal law conference, so I'm really just enjoying the warmness of the community here, and I actually now I'm learning that I missed out on the karaoke and the whiskey bar. I hope you've all had some strong coffee, and we're so excited to start out the morning with sharing some of this, which is also a little bit experimental. And we heard last night about how trying new ideas is very important in this space and finding sense of community. So we'll share more. We're going to be thinking today about bioacoustics and non-human analytical communication. So we all seen now in the last few years really how artificial intelligence has kind of permeated almost everything. We're just hearing about it so much. And most of this is for the human world. And everything is really geared towards Homo sapien. But there is now just starting to be a window is opening up into this world. And there are species like whales and bats and elephants that were able to use this technology of listening, and especially recorded in a special way of pipelining it so we could sort of translate the information. So this is very, very early days, and that's why it's good to be here and to share with you and to think about this and to share this collaboration with the More Than Human Life, with the César, on why this is important. I'm leading Project CETI, which is specifically focusing on sperm whales, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And we've now built up the largest communication database of any species thus far. But in the next 5 to 10 years, this technology will now permeate outward. It'll probably be other species. There's other groups looking at fungus and other species. So this is just an exciting aspect to kind of start getting your heads to wrap around this. And now I'll pass over to César.
Thank you, David. It's also my first animal law conference, although this is not the first time that I'm working on animal law issues, but it's especially important for me to be here doing this dance with David because we're very much in a legal experiment that I want to invite you all to, that starts with this image of the more than human world, a circle, one that is not necessarily hierarchical and that conceives of different ways of seeing the world and perceiving the world in non-hierarchical terms. But unfortunately, as we all know, that's not the dominant view of the more than human world and the planet that has dominated in Western law. I don't have to belabor the point here in the animal law conference, but this is the conventional hierarchical view of the more than human world, with humans at the top. And lawyers and scientists in the West have used all kinds of criteria to tell apart, to separate humans from non-humans, from sentience to intelligence. As I go up this hierarchy, the bar gets raised to consciousness. But of course, as many animals were shown to be sentient, then we were able to extend the legal protection, even some legal rights to animals like primates or elephants, or even octopi. Then anthropocentric lawyers and thinkers said, well, but they're really not intelligent. And then some animals were shown to be great problem solvers and to exhibit many forms of intelligence. But then they would say, well, they're surely not conscious. And then we have this year many of the leading consciousness scientists around the world coming out with a declaration, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. But then language. They would say, okay, they may be sentient, intelligent, conscious, but they surely cannot speak. And that has been a stumbling block for animal rights and animal welfare advocates. This is a quote from a well-known interview with Martha Nussbaum, who of course is a very prominent animal rights theorist, who said in an interview with the Legal Times that legal progress will be slower for non-human animals because their voices are not recorded and they don't participate directly in public policy. But what if? What if we were able to record animals in ways that would make their messages transparent to us? And this is the question that I want you to invite to consider with us today. And to that end, we're going to propose a framework. This is a framework that I proposed in the book that David mentioned, More Than Human Rights, where we go back to a more holistic and egalitarian understanding of the more than human world. I'm taking the more than human phrase from the fantastic work of David Abrams, the eco-philosopher who wrote the Spell of the Census on the more than human world. And I like this terminology because it puts human beings in the context of the web of life. So the more than human world includes the human species, but it's more than the human species. And so I come from a background in indigenous rights research and advocacy and human rights scholarship and advocacy. And I know that human rights has been traditionally an anthropocentric project. So I care deeply about expanding the circle of moral consideration and the practice of human rights to include the more than human world. And this is why in the MOTH project, we've been offering ideas through books. We also do convenings, and this is the only plug I'm going to make in this presentation. We're running a MOTH Festival of Ideas for lawyers and scholars, like everyone who's convened here at NYU in March 2025. We're bringing together scientists, artists, indigenous leaders, journalists, of course, judges and lawyers who are looking for ways to reconnect with the more than human world. And in the case of the law, through legal practice and new legal ideas. This is a convening, this is a picture from a convening that David and I attended just just 3-4 weeks ago in the Amazon that the MOTH Collective put together with the Sarayaku indigenous peoples of Ecuador. And we importantly, and this is what brings us today to this space, we run legal experiments. Because the mainstream, the legal mainstream is quite resilient, like any mainstream way of seeing the world, we want to push the boundaries and the envelope of that paradigm, of that legal paradigm. And in doing so, in the MOTH project, the More Than Human Rights project that I lead with colleagues at NYU Law, we take inspiration from two ways of seeing the world. One is what the novelist Richard Powers has called the humbling sciences, meaning the sciences, the Western sciences that put human beings in the context of the web of life, that put us in our place, so to speak. biology, ethology, ecology, geology, that look into ways of seeing the world that are not necessarily ours, and that put us in the context of deep time, as opposed to the short-term horizons that tend to dominate in legal thought and practice. And then importantly, we work very closely, and this is again my background, with indigenous peoples. And this is a recent picture from another trip to the Amazon, where we convened some of the world's leading mycologists, some colleagues there from SPUN, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, together with indigenous scientists to map out the underworld, the mycelial networks of the forest. And something along those lines is what we're doing with Project CETI. I'll end by inviting you, because I know that that Ed Young was a keynote here in a previous conference. And what I like about this title and about the work of Ed Young is that it really kind of summarizes and brings together incredibly exciting developments in science that are getting us closer to understand, or at least appreciate, other ways of seeing the world. And that's an immense world that's being opened up before our eyes. What I want to invite you together with David is to explore the immense legal world that opens up as we consider and take seriously questions like, what if we understood what animals are saying? What are the opportunities, but also the risks that come with this question and these technologies? And this is the context, of course, for our collaboration. So in our presentation today, we're going to be looking at two specific questions. What if it was proved that cetaceans have the capacity for language? And this, by the way, thanks to the recent findings and publications of Project CETI, is no longer in the realm of science fiction. It's in the realm of science. And I'll let David speak about this, because of course I'll butcher the science, so I won't say anything about that. But we now know that sperm whales have the capacity for complex language. And then a more forward-looking question is, what if the content of cetaceans' communications was understood? That hasn't yet happened, but since we are forward-looking lawyers and practitioners, we're looking at anticipating trends. And if anyone is interested, we explored these two questions in depth in a forthcoming article in Ecology Law Quarterly coming up next year. We won't have time to do something equally important, which is to consider the risks and the challenges that come with using even the gentlest technologies like Project CETI's to record animals like sperm whales and to process those data with machine learning tools. This is very much the progress, the other project that we're doing with Project CETI, which is, we'll have more to share about that soon. But what we're working on now is a paper on the legal and ethical guardrails that need to be put in place so that these studies benefit as opposed to harm sperm whales and other animals.
Thank you, César. So yeah, really happy to share more about what Project CETI is. And you might know this CETI, we took our name in homage to the SCTI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. We see ourselves as a search for interterrestrial intelligence, the intelligence here on Earth and deep in the ocean among sperm whales. I've come to this with 3 decades of marine biology experience, working all the way from microbes to turtles to sharks, and now in the last 5 years, I've finally worked my way up to whales. We're a nonprofit organization. We formed in 2020 with catalytic funding support from the TED Audacious Project. And we've now have partnered with National Geographic as our communication appendage, which will also give us lots of opportunities to be reaching kids, as well as having policy impacts as this. So the science is important, but it's the other parts of this that are equally as important. And thinking about this window opening, there's many people now beginning to think of this. And where César and I first met was actually only just about a year and a half ago. There's the Multi-Species Constitution Project that are beginning to think about these topics and been convening scholars in this area. And that's where we had met and kind of formed this collaboration. I like hearing even last night about how much collaboration there is in the animal law space and how beautiful those collaborations could be. So I think part of what we're sharing here today is this is the first time that we're co-presenting together and really sharing this collaboration of coming together. And thinking about collaboration, CETI is really a project of collaboration. We are now grown to 50 scientists across 8 different disciplines. So we're one of the most interdisciplinary science project around. And we are working in collaboration with the government and people of Dominica. And the reason we're working in Dominica is there are families of sperm whales there that live in complex societies that have been studied over the last 15 years. And it had already been shown by our lead biologist, Shane Garrow, that there's elements of regional dialects and accents there. Even among whales that are living in the same area, the different clans have different accents. So just to share a little bit about the whales that we have the honor and privilege to be working with. Here are the sperm whales. And you can hear them communicating. We'll talk more about their communication patterns. Off Dominica, they live in matrilineal societies with so women-led with grandmothers, mothers, and kids. When the males get to a certain age, they kind of kick them out. They form bachelor pairs and travel worldwide. There's the largest sexual dimorphism among sperm whales. Actually, males get almost to be about twice the size. They're about the size of the females are about the size of a school bus. So just working with them is, the size and the gentleness are some of the things, and just evolutionary, like how they became sperm whales over the last 50 million years, their nose rolling over their head to become a blowhole. The part of their brain that's evolved for processing sound is probably the equivalent to bats being able to see as much as they can hear. But what's really kind of drawing us to this is one thing is also the narrative. These are animals that are Moby Dick, that were described as beasts and leviathans. And working with them, they're some of the most gentle, non-violent creatures you could imagine in that regard. So really just in shifting the narrative here. In thinking about working together, it's really beautiful. I'm getting to explore a legal world, so quite nervous here to be talking to a bunch of legal scholars and marine biologists. But also I get the opportunity to bring César to Dominica to be meeting the whales. And actually, this is one of our testings that we use to test our drones out before we actually work with the real whales. And but now thinking about this, a little bit about dig into the science just quickly, we're essentially decoding an unknown communication system. So there is a whale, as you just saw them earlier, that are sending information to each other. And what they're doing is they're using 2 different types of sounds. You'll hear click, 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 echolocation. And for that, they've been doing that for tens of millions of years, and they're probably a huge portion of their brain is developed towards processing their auditory. So I like to think of them as the bats of the sea. And probably if you ask the whale how they're seeing the deep world diving to a mile, it would be like asking us like how to describe our vision. But they're also at the surface communicating in these codas, these short bursts. That are used mainly for communication, sometimes even putting their heads together and talking right into each other's heads via bone conduction. The process in how they're making these sounds is still not fully understood, but there is a process called the bent horn hypothesis, where they're moving some air, which is snapping back through the head, going back off the back of the head through the spermaceti oil, and then through a series of lenses where they can focus it on a very small object, or it could go very broadly. So here's just a quick rendition of how they're making sound. From the frontal sacs off that back air sac. And then they're perceiving in their brain, a big portion of their brain is to perceive these echoes. And they're obviously doing quite good at this because they're eating quite a bit of squid. So they communicate with clicks. We know they're obviously, they don't need any help from us on that front. And here are the clicks that they're using. And one of the first ways that we would consider is just consider these interclick intervals of like knowing like what's going on. There's clicks, but you could notice that there's spaces in between it. You could start to even know each whale by as I could possibly use machine learning here to identify everyone here has a specific voice, and we'd be able to isolate out specific features in everybody's voice. We're getting to the point where we could do that in whales, that once we actually know each of the individuals, just by the sounds, we could identify each one of them. But they're communicating in these small stereotypical bursts called codas. One other thing to notice, it wasn't until 1957 that they even knew that whales made sounds. So it's like our understanding of these creatures is not doesn't have as long as a history as some of the things on land. And there's many different types of them. One of the things that we just expanded on was the number of types of codas and how they could use them. I'm going to show you now a little bit of the types of codas they're using. In Dominica, there's the 113. So you'll hear often like click, 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 click. And these are two whales, but then you'll also see in the back here another whale far away that they're calling over. So by having a combination of hearing them and then seeing them from the surface, we're being able to glean a little bit more. Yep. There, see the other blow in the distance? So just to give a little idea of trying to have the Umwelt of peering into their world, a little bit more about the science of how we're doing this. Again, thinking interdisciplinary, we're working with roboticists, with linguists. Linguists is one of the new things for animal behavior, is primarily before linguistics has been something that's been reserved for human speech, machine learning, underwater signal acoustic processing, marine biology, cryptography, theoretical analysis, complexity science, probably missing a few here of the types of disciplines. And the way to collect the data sets is in a holistic way. And actually having the context is the most important thing. As we all know, working with animals, if you're just hearing them and you're not knowing what's actually happening in the context, it's hard to know exactly what they're saying. So we're working with different data visualization. And the other part now is how to get this information. Something like sperm whales are something that the window for humans has not been open that long, that we could actually peer into their world. These are animals that you'll see them at the surface for 5-10 minutes, and then they'll dive to a mile deep, and you won't know anything that was happening. You'll hearing a little bit of them, and then they'll surface again. So we just realized in 2019 that with all the advances in robotics and translation, that actually this window for Homo sapiens, for us to kind of deeply peer into their world, has just opened. So this kind of opportunity is now just happening. And coming to this from decades of marine science, one of the things that I've always recognized is working with gentleness and care. And thinking about how we do anything is how we do everything. And so I've been collaborating with Rob Wood, a roboticist at the Harvard Microrobotics Lab, and we've been designing like some of the gentlest robots. We even worked, I was actually used to work in jellyfish and corals before this, and we invented a manipulator that could interact and study jellyfish that would be able to touch jellyfish with 1/10 of the pressure as your eyelid resting on your eyeball. So really bringing to this field the idea of gentleness and how we're going about this. In the past of studying sperm whales, they would actually harpoon things into them or take plugs of skin. So we have a philosophy of absolutely no blood. And at the time being, when we're putting tags on the whales, we're also thinking about how to do it in the most gentle way. And the ultimate goal is to move to a completely passive way. And here's a bit of our ecosystem. This is what's known as our core whale listening station. We have 3 of these in Dominica, and they are able to give us a 3D dynamic map of where the whales are within 20 kilometers. And again, at Rob Wood's lab at the Harvard Microrobotics Lab, we've had to develop new types of sensors that can go on the whales that are specifically designed for machine learning. And these are things that are actually measuring the heart rate. They'll have a gyroscope in them, so we'll know if they're going down. They'll have a depth sensor, temperature, all types of different variables that are giving us context in them. And in thinking about how we attach them, we had a postdoc, Alyssa Hernandez, who had done 2 years just on adhesion, studying clingfish and suckerfish, because you'll see the whales already have these fish on them, to be able to make our tags with suction cups that are inspired by suckerfish. So they'll stay on anywhere from 12 hours to a few days. In Dominica, there's about 50 to 400 whales, depending on the season. Again, Shane Garrow, our lead biologist, knows every one of them by name, and because of the differences in the back of their flukes, so they could identify each one of these as individuals. So we could be collecting, hypothetically, between 400 million to 4 billion clicks a year. And to put that into perspective, going into this project, we would have been a dot that you couldn't even see on this graph. As if you now see the GPT-3, which is 500 billion. We're now moving into ChatGPT-4, which is over 1 trillion. CETI is projected is the red circle there. So even if we kind of get to our mark, we're still quite small as a non-human animal data set compared to what we know about humans. One of the beautiful things about working with the type of people that this project has been attracting is, like, for instance, like Shafi Goldwasser, who's leading our theory team. She actually helped me start this project when I was doing a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard in 2018. She has a Turing Award in cryptography for basically coming up with the fundamentals of how you could do internet cryptography, so how even internet banking is possible. But this is one of the first papers on animal behavior that was in a leading computer science conference, and it's setting up a theory for unsupervised machine translation for animal communication. And one of the key things that come out of this finding are that if their communication system, we actually use communication system now instead of saying language, because language is a trigger. But if their communication system is complex, it'll be easier to use unsupervised machine translation. And also how much of their world is in common with our world will make it actually easier. So those will be the first things to translate, where our world and the sperm whale world overlap. We're also, earlier this year, we shared a sperm whale phonetic alphabet, which shows that sperm whales are communicating with both contextual and combinational features, which actually moves them closer to humans, and with just a few other types of animals that they've been able to show have both of these features. There's some exciting, I can't share them yet, but in the coming year, we're going to even be pushing this boundary even forward with language-like features that we're finding in whales, again, that have likely been speaking for 20 million years. So it could be uncovering features of one of the more ancient types of languages. This is, I can't share or reiterate how much luck plays a role in this work. One day, we were out there and we were studying the whales, and we noticed something unique happening. We noticed that there was 12 whales that were together that normally aren't together. They're in separate units. And they were kind of very close together, which we thought maybe there was some predator or something around that was bothering them. And they were just doing this behavior of going up and down and up and down. So we just kind of stood and watched, and we actually put 2 drones up in the air to just kind of record from above so we could see what's happening. And then we kind of got scared. All of a sudden, things started thrashing, and there was this huge bit of blood in the water. And we thought there was a shark attack that was happening here. But then if you look closer, you might see something in the lower right-hand corner. Yeah. So we were watching, this was one of the first like heavily documented sperm whale births. Again, I was thinking of like Melville and Moby Dick and this Leviathan and this killer. And here is a sperm whale birth. And we're analyzing this data. This looks like it could be one of the most collective events that is seen across any mammal ever. I guess you might say there's humans, there could have been examples, but we are analyzing this across other species like bonobos. And what's really interesting for us is that when the baby came out, we know that they've been sperm whales for tens of millions of years, but they're still coming out in a position where the fluke is not formed and folded back. So the baby is unable to swim, and it was kind of slithering along the top of the surface. And the family members, which we know each of them by individual, work together collectively. And I'll just share one little piece of video of just a few seconds of this, where they're working collectively to hold the baby above it. This is one of our really special pieces of footage, so I won't talk during it. Yeah, so you could see that happening there. And then another thing is we did have underwater recordings. So we have now have a full multimodal data set expanding 6 hours here. So this is another feature that the team has been working for a year and a half almost on this, designing all the software that'll allow us to unequivocally design a social network for whales and to understand some of the new sounds that were made and to be able to put this into context. So I'll now pass off to César about the opportunities.
So what does this all mean for the law and for opportunities that are opened up by these findings? And this is the question that we explore in the paper that I mentioned earlier, which we wrote with our colleagues, Ashley Nemeth and Gaspar Begus. So I'm going to have to go through some of these ideas very quickly, but the paper will be available in early December in SSRN, in our SSRN pages, and it will be published next year. So the first question that we ask ourselves is, what if it was proved that cetaceans have the capacity for language? And this is, we're arguing in the paper, has already happened. It's already happening. This is not the future. So if you read the paper about the alphabet, the sperm whale alphabet, you realize, and this is me kind of interpreting freely from the science paper, that features of human language, like phonemes that can be combined in creative ways to create potentially meaning are there. The building blocks, what CETI has shown is that the sperm whale language or communication exhibits some features that would allow the sperm whales to combine those features into complex messages. The complex messages in themselves have not been substantiated or interpreted, but we know that there are building blocks, and therefore there's the capacity for language that approaches the complexity of human language. So what I want to argue, and we argue in the paper, is that already gives legal scholars and practitioners new arguments and ammunition to protect, in this case, sperm whales, but in the future, other animals. And we can extrapolate from what's happened with similar scientific findings on other animals. Although Project CETI is the project that's farthest along in actually showing the existence of these complex structures in past decades, through the Great Apes project and other projects. The science on the cognitive capacity of animals like chimpanzees or primates or even elephants have led to legal efforts, for example, to recognize animal rights through litigation. If you read the decision of a New York court in the Happy the Elephant case, one of the reasons why Happy was not recognized as a legal subject, and you can see the decision, of course, many of you know it already. What is said there is that Happy the elephant cannot be considered as a legal person because it wasn't shown that elephants can engage in cooperative social behavior and then therefore cannot take on social responsibilities and legal duties. But what about that highly cooperative birth event? Shane Garrow has said in an interview that the sperm whales are probably the largest, make up the largest groups of culturally cooperative animals outside of human species. So I would love for future judges in similar cases to consider the new evidence and say that because of the new findings of Project CETI and other similar collectives in the future, we now know that animals do have cultures, animals like sperm whales do have cultures, and that they do play social functions. They help, they collaborate on the birth of a baby, that they speak to each other in dialects that are clear cultural markers of social groupings. There's, of course, the possibility of new legislation or the enforcement of existing legislation based on these new findings. And also, just as it happened in many countries with a greater protection of animals like primates or even mollusks, the fact that we know about the complexity and the capacity for complex communication of sperm whales and future other animals can boost arguments for ratcheting up kind of an increase in raising the bar in terms of the protection of animals that are used for animal research. Now, moving on to a forward-looking question. What if in the future we understood the content of cetaceans' communication? And there we argue that new possibilities come up that are fascinating for legal thought and advocacy. And I'm going to give you just one example that we give in the paper, but because this is crucial and because the evidence from David's videos help us understand this example. So as you know from the videos, sperm whales are highly auditory. I mean, they see very little, but they're fantastic listeners. So all their worldview and the capacity to communicate with each other, to spot potential prey, to operate in their pods and in their cultures depend on their being able to talk to each other, to listen, to hear each other in the deep waters. But we're contaminating those waters with noise. And the noise is increasing and it's becoming louder and louder. So just ship noise directly affects the capacity for communication of these highly auditory animals. And by the way, there's a little mistake here in this graph from which I'm responsible. David made me realize that this is not where the sound waves should be coming out of the whales, because they don't speak out of their mouths, but of their heads. So this is a lawyer's rendition of sperm language communication, and it will be promptly fixed for the next iteration of this presentation.
This is our first time.
Yes, yes. But the point being here is that just like in human rights, overstimulation, incessant kind of blasting of light and noise is considered widely as a form of torture. That animal law experts will be able to make powerful arguments about against noise pollution and for the control of noise pollution that reinforce the implementation of existing pieces of legislation like the Endangered Species Act. And if you want to learn about the details of how we think that the SA can be better implemented through the use of this evidence in the future, you can see the details in our paper. But the point being is that arguments that are now seen as outlandish and improbable can be better substantiated through this growing field of research. I already spoke about freedom from torture, but I also want to speak to a potential right to cultural life. One of the most mind-blowing findings, as I have been reading up and on sperm whale cultures and societies, and as I spend time with the Project CETI scientists, is the fact that they're highly cultural individuals and societies. So Shane Garrow explained to me in Dominica that a pod or a clan that is into fish will not eat octopi, right? Even if they starve to death, right? So they have clear food preferences. They speak in dialects. And when they come closer to other pods, they sharpen the linguistic differences to differentiate themselves from the clan that's nearby, which is exactly what we do as human beings. We kind of double down on our differences so that we gossip about the people in the next table to better reinforce our cultural identity in any given table, in any given group of friends. So speaking of culture, is no longer as controversial as it used to be when it comes to sperm whales and other animals. And because there's such a thing as the right to cultural life, our argument in the paper is that the learnings and the doctrines and the norms on the right to cultural life can be adapted, expanded for a new understanding of the right to cultural life of sperm whales and, in the future, other animals. I want to end by just flagging the existence of risks and challenges, again, because of, in the interest of time and because we're working on another paper on precisely this issue. I'm just going to mention them in passing. Of course, these technologies come with challenges that need to be addressed. For example, the manipulation of animals for profit and other forms of exploitation that these technologies and their understanding of animal communication can bring with it. Infringements on autonomy because of invasive forms of research that Project CETI is addressing, as David mentioned, and also potential harms, physical, psychological, and communal harms to individuals and ecosystems.
Yeah, I don't know. Just in ending, to bring back those things. There's all the benefits and there's all the risks, but really the reason that's motivating me to be doing this project are the benefits. And thinking about this is a way to advance animal law, as a way to bring us closer together, as a hypothesis. I feel at this moment now, there's been so many examples of technology that are actually drawing us apart from animals in nature. Is it possible to bring it together? But also to kind of recognize that this is all very new, and we're just excited to share and to digest with you. One other thing is that we're Roger Payne and Katie Payne, who had found that whales sing, led to the Save the Whale movement. Roger was a principal advisor to Project CETI before passing away last year, and really infused us with all the lessons from the Save the Whales movement that we've taken with us. But just to recognize in the next few years, this will really start expanding, and not all groups are coming at it with this kinds of empathy and care for the animals. So there's other groups that are potentially more tech-based and don't have any animal experience that are beginning to approach this. So considering the risks is very important and something that we take very serious. But again, we're still driven by the positivity of what this could draw, and we invite you all to kind of think with us as we kind of venture into this territory. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic and so inspirational. So we'll kick off our Q&A and then we'll open it up to the audience. So my first question is for you, David. Where do you imagine the science of translating non-human animal communication or non-human communication will be in 5 to 10 years from now?
I think right now we're starting to see some of these fundamental language-like features that's starting to appear, but it's been challenging to kind of set everything up in a way where we could translate non-human communication, especially in the ocean. So we've gone through a long learning curve of what's working and what's not working. And I think that in the next 5 years, we'll really start that big data climb. I think one of the things, again, we're a nonprofit, and we got catalytic funding from the TED Audacious. So if you compare, I find it fascinating now, in one sense, the machine, it's not like you just take animal language, and you throw it into a machine and out comes a translation. There are just a tremendous amount of steps and details, and that's why it's beginning to work with one animal at a time and focusing. And it's not necessarily that the computers have played a role here, it's more the fact of the interdisciplinary team that all looking at it from their different lenses that allowed us to start seeing these, and then we could train it. So I think it's really just a question of motivation. Right now, probably the reason why the data sets are so small up until now is that there just hasn't been the money as look at the amount of money that there is to sell stuff to each other. So the capitalistic incentives for the human communication databases, which has led to our large language models. So I think it really just depends on the interest. and what is the motivation to do this? So, but I think that's why it's a good to be thinking about these things now, because this is clearly, Karen Backer in her book kind of describes it as Karen Backer wrote a book called The Sounds of Life, which I recommend. Was really good. She unfortunately also passed away last year, untimely. And she equates this to the next telescope or microscope as a tool. And think of the unaided eye being able to look out into the cosmos or into cells. Like combining acoustics with AI is kind of giving us a similar tool, but to notice all the features of the more than human world that maybe our old world primate selves couldn't quite translate on our own. So it's exciting. I mean, we're really excited about the possibilities and making sure though that we paddle into those possibilities and we set the tone right from the very first steps. So we still do have time now to think about those things before they kind of could turn in any other direction.
No, it definitely is very exciting. And thank you also for identifying those risks and challenges. I think that is a crucial part, of course, of the research. Yes, so thank you. My next question, César, is for you. Your forthcoming article in Ecology Law Quarterly takes a forward-looking view of the intersection between animal law and animal communication studies, and you emphasize that as well here today. What do you see as the most promising avenues for this type of legal research and action in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, this is a wide open space. So what it becomes will depend on people like you all in terms of research and advocacy and litigation and regulation. I'll flag a couple of avenues for research and practice that I think are particularly exciting and promising. The MOTH project, the More Than Human Rights project, is very much invested in pushing forward research and litigation on the rights of nature, not just animals, but also ecosystems, for instance, a part of the work that we do. And recently we published a report on the implementation of what I think is the most sophisticated ruling on rights of nature anywhere in the world, which was handed down by the Constitutional Court of Ecuador in 2021 to protect the Los Cedros forest and highly biodiverse ecosystem in the Andes and Chocó region in Ecuador. But oftentimes we as researchers and practitioners, when there's an important win, we move on to the next case. We're interested in the MOTH project to make sure that those rulings are implemented and working very closely with lawyers and scientists in Ecuador to keep the pressure on the Ecuadorian government to comply with the court ruling. That meant the court ruling meant that there's no mining in the forest anymore, and therefore the many endemic species of animals, fungi, and plants are protected now. So when you take that to the specific domain of animal law, then as I hinted at in the presentation, I think that litigating or relitigating cases based on using this new evidence is a highly promising avenue. In the paper, we also make a case for cases and lawsuits that try to mainstream the idea of legal personhood for animals. And of course, because legal personhood has been denied, not everywhere, by the way, the US in this is an outlier. Sometimes I tell my students who think that there's no hope for legal personhood for animals, you're living in a very unique space where advancing those claims is particularly challenging. In other jurisdictions like Argentina, like Ecuador, even India and some others, for example, in the well-known case of Cecilia the chimpanzee in Argentina, the court specifically said that the reason why they were treating Cecilia as a subject of rights, as a legal person, was because science had shown that the species that Cecilia belonged to had been shown to exhibit cognitive capacities that brought them close to human beings as subjects of rights. So tacking legal personhood to what science shows is a strategy that is evolving. The frontier, the boundary between the human and the non-human is changing, and therefore I think there are new avenues for litigation and advocacy. I'll just mention another one very quickly, which is the implementation and enforcement of existing legislation. So this is and even with existing evidence, we don't have to wait until the day when perhaps Project CETI and other collectives will be able to translate sperm whale communication or animal communication, but with the existing evidence about the capacity for complex language, I think that, for example, arguments that have been used to deny protection to sperm whales and other species by saying, for example, that sperm whales or whales in general are habituated to noise pollution, to noise from ship traffic. So how do we know that they're habituated, right? So if we understand clearly that they're saying that this is, I don't know what the message would be. It wouldn't be very gentle. It would be hard to take. But if we understand that they're suffering from the existing levels of noise, then that, of course, creates avenues for defending them before the courts, before the legislators, before the legislatures and governments at large.
Thank you so much. Sorry, my final question is actually for both of you. So the collaboration between MOTH and CETI seems like it's a very unique transdisciplinary collaboration. Do you have any precedent for other similar collaborations that are taking place right now? And can you also share a bit more about how the gears turned with both of you working together and how the collaboration actually plays out?
Sure, you want me to start it?
Yeah.
No, I mean, of course, I think I'm all for radical collaboration. I think that's a key to a lot of the issues now, even if looking at things like climate change, and I even see it's approached in such a siloed way. So approaching, first off the project from a radical collaboration basis, like we all come to it speaking totally different languages and different terms, but we kind of come together that we're doing something together. We're all working and using whatever our skill sets are and respecting each other's skill sets. And I think with César, it's exactly that. Like I am not a lawyer, and I don't have any experience really in law. So this is why it's so beautiful, because your lens that you're coming to this. But I think we also saw that a lot of your previous work had also taken on a collaborative approach. So I think as I even heard last night in thinking of the nonprofit award, the pro bono awards, like you have to really enjoy who you're working with. Life is short, and you want to be, you want a sense of community. So I feel that we found a sense of community in exploring the different skill sets that we have together. But we'll talk more about like how we work. But Mel, I'll pass it to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that I realized as we at the MOTH Rights Collective have gone deeper into various forms of advancing ecocentric approaches to the law is that some of the most interesting and kind of decisive pushes and sources of inspiration are to be found in the quote-unquote hard sciences. Right, so it's interesting, and my PhD is in sociology, but I was trained as a lawyer and as a philosopher, and I now know that social scientists and lawyers are more resistant to blurring the line between humans and non-humans than hard scientists are. So the MOTH Collective, the MOTH Rights, is actually doing something very simple, which is doing some science shaming on the lawyers, right? Like when I'm telling my colleagues, well, you seem to be holding on to a categorical distinction that hard scientists, the ones who know about the animals, about fungi, about plants. For God's sake, we have now evidence of plant intelligence from the work of Monica Gagliano. We have findings on how fungi solve problems because of the work of fantastic mycologists like my colleagues in the MOTH Collective, Merlin Sheldrick and Juliana Furci and Toby Kears. And for lawyers to hang on to an outdated categorical distinction, Aristotelian distinction between humans and non-humans, that is unfathomable to me. So what we do is saying, like, look, the law has always had this epistemological insecurity vis-a-vis the hard sciences. Well, so now these people who use the experiments and the robotics and the AI, they're saying that the lines are much blurrier. So this is also not only a challenge, but also an invitation for that collaboration to have very direct and current and present consequences on the legal field. And this is why, of course, I enjoy working with David and Project CETI, scientists, roboticists. I do have to say that when I attend their meetings, I think I understand 20% of what they're saying because it's a lot of that is on AI. But the 20% that I understand, and I think that David also understands 20% of what we in the MOTH team say about the law, which is fine because that's complementarity. But similar efforts, you asked her about similar efforts in other fields. The one that I'll flag because we're very invested in it in the MOTH collective is we're working very closely with mycologists, experts in the underground world, people who are mapping out mycelial networks around the world and showing us that there's a whole world and a whole other kingdom of life that we haven't paid attention to. So talk about an immense world. That's an immense world underneath that's remained invisible. And one of the other reasons why, and we're doing exactly the same, and as I said in the presentation, crucially to us, engaging with indigenous science is a source of learning. And we are in the process of putting together an indigenous council as part of the collaboration between CETI and MOTH, because many cultures have talked to whales for a long time in their own ways, in places as diverse as Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, the Caribbean. And if we're serious about collaboration, then other forms of knowledge need to be taken into account.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for those wonderful presentations and for this very informative Q&A. I'll open the mics up to the audience for our general Q&A now. If you have a question, please line up behind one of the two microphones in the front of the room. And for those joining us virtually, you can submit questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I think the work you're doing is incredible, and it returns me to kind of the feeling of humility and wonder towards the natural world I felt as a child. So thank you. My question has to do with whale language. We discussed dialect, culture, ritual. Do you suspect or know that these whales are using names or other abstract reference to refer to one another? And relatedly, if you had to make a kind of wild conjecture, how likely do you think it is that these whales are using more abstract language more broadly, for instance, referring to emotions or other subjective interior experiences in their communications with one another?
That's a great question. I think in terms of names, it's not been shown in whales yet, but there was actually just a machine learning study with Nikki Pardo who came to our, we've been hosting at the University of California, Berkeley's Simons Institute of Theory of Computing for the last 4 years. We do an annual decoding non-communication workshop. And it's been a nice forum for all different types of people working with different animals to kind of come together and realize where some of the problems are at the, at the basic levels. And so that was just shown in elephants. And I would say, of course, probably for whales. I think I always try to keep my mind completely open to all these ideas of abstract thought. And I mean, a lot of my day, I just try to imagine, like, previous work I did before this is I made animal eye cameras, like I made a shark eye camera that would try to see the world from the perspective of the shark. So kind of really trying to kind of put oneself into their perspective is important. So I think the more abstract things are definitely possible, but now I'm trying to go through from like a Western science perspective, how would we show that? And these get interesting because it's like, how, it's like, as ways we hear last night of like thinking about creative legal arguments, like we also have to think creatively on how we would design the experiments to be able to show that. And especially because we're taking these non-invasive principles in place. So we can't I'm not like putting the whale on an MRI machine or looking at their brain waves. So it kind of makes it even more challenging, but maybe makes it all the more, more of a challenge to do. So anyway, it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question that side.
Thank you for your talk. My question, well, I had two questions, but I'll have to just ask one question. My question is, people working in animal protection welfare, there is a saying that, we need to use our voice for the voiceless, being animals. But I mean, of course, I support that and I agree. But at the same time, when we look at animals, they have their way of showing or communicating, expressing their suffer, like their discomfort, etc. I think it's more like on humans that we just don't try to understand what they're trying to voice to us. And I just wondered if you have any views on that as someone who is studying the animal communication, and or any comments. And also, just very briefly, you briefly mentioned the underwater noise pollution, and there is a technological kind of discussion going on to develop quiet shipping. And I think what you're studying can be a really appealing case to really pressure that technology to go further to make the ocean quieter for these animals. So thank you.
Yeah, the first part, I guess, about giving a voice to the voiceless. So I always think about it, they have a voice, so we don't have to give them any voice. They've been speaking and we just haven't been listening. And that just, I always kind of turn that around in terms of they definitely don't need to be given a voice. In that regard, it's now kind of up to us to be able to listen deeply, to know what they're saying. And I agree with you. That is the point about making their world quiet. Even just recognizing is that we're listening on our headphones and sound travels 5.5 times faster underwater. And you could hear a boat from like way out in the distance and you could see these whales communicating. So it really, you really see how underwater sound could be. It would be like, imagine right now if there was a jackhammer going off in this room and nobody knew about it and we would all be getting annoyed, and this could be going on for years for them and they could be enduring, great suffering. So yeah, that's kind of one of the early things that I think we could look at, especially as César identified this right to not be tortured. So yeah, but thank you for that question.
Yeah, just to add on the voice part of the question, I imagine, and I've run this mental thought experiment, and imagine what the early users of the microscope saw, and so they must have seen all these small particles, right, and wonder what is this, right? So that the tool itself, the instrument itself, opened up a new world that they couldn't interpret or understand. So this is, I think, what's happening now. So now the tools allow us to listen, to know that there's a voice there, but we have no idea what's being said because of our perceptual limitations, right? Because of our 5 senses, because of our own little world. So in any effort at translating, and I see our collaboration very much as a mutual translation of scientific findings into the law, and then the scientists also need the legal and ethical guidance, which is in short supply in the use of AI in other domains, that by translating each other's ideas into languages that are familiar to each of us, the law, science, and so on, we will get better at listening also to other cultures and other animals whose voices are very much there, but whose messages we cannot understand because of our limitations. So speaking, someone mentioned the humility. One of the things that I love about the word, the root of the word human, which is that it's the same root as the word humble, humility, and humus, which is earth. So in the paper, in the chapter, intro chapter to the book that I mentioned earlier, I say that, literally, human rights means earthlings' rights, right? So it's the rights of earthlings, and being aware of the limitations that all of the earthlings of this or the Earthlings have in terms of understanding what other Earthlings are saying is a good starting point for a more humble approach to the recognition and potentially the protection of other beings and the web of life.
Thank you so much. We'll take a question from one of our virtual attendees.
For people who would like to work on gaining skills and in the areas of expertise to be able to work in this area of communication, do you have a sense of what would be the most needed and the most helpful in studying linguistics and animal communication?
That's a great question. I think right now, we're getting so much interest from people that want to help like that, and we really appreciate that. Now we've been beginning this data climb, and we haven't had that much data until now, but we've now developed all the tooling. So we're beginning to explore ways of creating open data communities, open science communities, and be able to kind of put in place ways where people could plug in. Because I really feel that it's a great question, and we feel a lot of scientists coming a lot from the big institutions that want to contribute their skill sets to this, and it's warming. And I wish I had I want to create that, but we've just been limited in what we can do. But now that we begin to get the data set climbing, I imagine in the next like 2 years, we'll have something more there. But I think in the meantime, just reviewing all the lectures from the Decoding Communication in Non-Human Species at Berkeley, and kind of reviewing the fields, reviewing our roadmap papers, reviewing hopefully this law paper that'll be up shortly, would be a good thing, and until we have a specific way for you to plug in. But thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. My question would be, how does the use of sonar in the Navy affect the communication abilities of sperm whales?
So anything that's making a noise on top of their noise is going to, which is in the same range of their hearing, they'll at least know whether it's more of it's a chronic. You could imagine same thing if there's somebody doing construction in this building for an hour, you might be able to tolerate it. The things that we're looking for on the theoretical side are quite interesting. Like there's things called in science called fault tolerance. Like if I didn't join the karaoke last night, but imagine it got really loud at the karaoke, and we were trying to talk. Okay, it's more than karaoke. Then there was like I don't know, a techno band or something playing. And eventually we were trying to have this very complicated conversation. But as it got louder and louder, the conversation would just kind of drop off. Like we've all been in those situations. And then I would just be like, do you want something to drink? And so you can start looking for those features. Those are things that the patternations could find. So we'll soon be able to know those things, as we have the data sets on how the communication starts shifting as noise levels increase, we'll be able to kind of get at that more unequivocally. But, my theory is of course, it's probably bothering them.
Thank you.
Once Project CETI successfully decodes sperm whale communication, do you have plans to try to establish two-way communication between humans and cetaceans?
Two-way communication, we thought about that at the beginning. So at the very early part of the project, there was like this idea that we're gonna talk back. But I think that over the course of the last few years, I've changed my mind on that. And it's turned much more into a listening project. And I started to realize these whales have been hearing us every day from our boats, from our plastic in the water. They're well aware of our presence. There's nothing that I have to say to them, and then so I've been asking people, and actually this is beautiful with National Geographic to be able to ask lots of people, what would you say if you did have that two-way? And I always kind of put that question back at the person who's asking it. Like if we did have that two-way, would there be any kind of message you'd want to send to the whale?
That's a good question. I mean, from a legal perspective, I'd ask them the questions that would help us in a legal case, what would help us establish things that would be persuasive to a court, as far as convincing a court that they are sentient and have community and have the things that would convince a court that they are a species that would, have rights and assume duties and all the things that the courts have said we don't think that they have. So those are the questions I'd ask and get the answers and give to the court.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's the first time I've heard that response, of course, because it's the first time hanging out in a group of lawyers like this. So I love that. That's actually because up until now, my previous favorite response was, "I'm sorry." That would be the one thing that we would say. But that's a really creative.
One thing that makes me think of is, again, we're in the process of putting together these guardrails, ethical and legal guardrails. And David and I were interviewed by a journalist with The Atlantic who asked precisely this question. So you might want to check out his article. His name is Ross Anderson. And he asked a bunch of people, researchers, writers, us, what we would say if it came to that first encounter. And I had a really hard time with that question. As a lawyer, I said, well, it would depend, right? And I ever since I've thought about how to first think about how to use the precautionary principle to engage in playback, to even consider the possibility of whether or not that would harm or not, or benefit the whales. So there's a preliminary question that I would like to explore, and I think that environmental lawyers are very well equipped to consider more situations of potential harm that need to be approached cautiously, like potentially playing back sounds and talking back to whales.
We have time for one more question.
So I'm curious for your thoughts on a linked opportunity and risk legally connected to this question of animal language. So if we look at early 1900s animal protection law, there are a few common formulations of the definition of animal that lawmakers seem to have selected, and a very popular one is every living dumb creature, i.e. creatures that lack the capacity for language. So given the work that you've outlined, opportunity-wise, do you think that implies an opportunity to argue that animals, because they have linguistic capacity, are entitled to more than the rights they receive under animal protection statute? Risk, do you have a concern that if that drops animals out of the definition of animal, it doesn't provide them with a legal niche? Should we be looking at legislation to get out in front of that to create a new category, assuming courts aren't willing to elevate them immediately to a particularly labeled status of person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd have to look at the details of the legislation and the case law, but I think that you're right in identifying kind of the double-edged nature of the move, right? Because and I'll, rather than engage with the question, because I'd love to follow up with you about the language of that particular piece of legislation, but I'll say something that I am dealing with currently that speaks to that risk opportunity ambiguous nature. The term more than human rights, I offered it as an attempt to protect animals, fungi, plants, the organic world. But we're in the middle of this explosion of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I've been contacted by some scholars and some practitioners who say, well, by more than human rights, did you mean AI rights, robot rights? And I said, no, not really. And they say, and then I got an email back from one of them saying, well, you're so biocentric. And I said, yes, I think I'm biocentric. I'm for life. I'm for life and I'm for organic life. But that speaks to kind of the need to preempt uses of categories that we might offer with the best intentions to expand the circles of moral and legal considerations in a way that may end up being used in a different way, or even as I see some of those efforts to protect, not all, to protect synthetic forms of life as a way to further untether from the more than human world, from the organic web of life, as opposed to reconnect it with that life. So thank you for the question, and that's I'd love to continue that conversation.
Time now. Thank you so much again for being here, David and César. This was such a fantastic presentation and we learned so much. Please.
Thank you.